Welcome to medieval times. Very interesting times about which most people know very little. And so I hope that you are challenged tonight, as well as and maybe even surprised. Hopefully you're not bored. But that shall remain to be seen. All right, let's ask God's blessing on our time. Father, thank you that no matter what time of period we look at, we can always see you at work. And we thank you that even in the somewhat everyday activities or the somewhat unusual things that occurred during the time period we're looking at, that we know that you are in sovereign control. We thank you for that, and thankful that we can see you at work then and now. Even though we may not understand what you're doing, we know that you are in charge, and so we trust you in that. We pray that you would guide our thinking tonight, help us understand what was happening in such a way that we can not only understand then, but understand now different forces at work. We pray that you accomplish these things according to your sovereign will. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, we are looking at in the notes the place where it says rivalry between Pope and Emperor, the investiture struggle, and I'll explain that as we go along here. But we're reaching a point where the popes and kings are going to start going at each other. And this is going to set up what's going to happen even centuries later. So it's important for us to see the background of that, and just to see what's going on in the church as well. One of the things that I've tried to communicate to people that have inquired about the class is that we want to see God at work. We want to see what God was doing. And we want to see, as like somebody asked me, was this a history of the church or history of of politics, of secular history? Yeah, it's both, because they're intertwined. And there's no separating, especially during the Middle Ages, when everything that occurred in Europe, especially, related to the church, because the church was dominant. It was Christendom. Everyone considered themselves part of the church. And so whatever was happening in society, the church certainly had a part of it, whether it is good or bad. All right, so we're looking at the rivalry between the Pope and Emperor. The issue here is that there were those that wanted to try to reform things in the church, to make changes, to rescue the papacy from its weakness and corruption. In short, the debate here is going to be between popes and German kings over who appoints bishops in Germany, because whoever makes the appointments has the greater power. So it's a power struggle between popes and German kings. The court, okay, that didn't work. Okay, now the slides are not going forward. Oh, there it goes. Must not have clicked hard enough. Okay, so that's the issue. And we have here the greatest of the reforming popes, Gregory VII. The background we'll leave that there. The background of the issue is this. You remember back when we talked about the Carolingian Empire? That was those kings that were descendants of Charlemagne, or Charles the Great. And remember how things disintegrated after a time? We had the advent of what were called the do-nothing kings, where the mayors of the palace, those that were kind of running things behind the scenes, actually began to take over as kings. And so that weakness left a political vacuum in Europe. At the same time, the Roman papacy had become so decadent that there was an ecclesiastical or a spiritual vacuum. So at the same time, you've got both of these entities losing power, losing control. We come to a guy by the name of Henry the Fowler. Now, do you know what a fowler is?
Doesn't it have something to do with birds?
Yeah, that's right. See if I have that here. Henry the Fowler apparently was good at using birds to hunt. That's they would do. And he founded the Saxon dynasty of Germany, which is the beginning of the German Empire. And he kind of filled in some of this power vacuum and brought stability and consolidation, especially versus the Norsemen, the Viking invaders. So he kind of rallied the Germans around and was able to bring some stability there. He was followed by Otto the First, or Otto the Great. Otto the Great did two things. First of all, he mastered the church in Germany. By mastering the church, I mean that he basically controlled the church, and he did so by naming and appointing bishops in the church. All right, you understand what I'm talking about there? That he appointed bishops in the different churches, and of course the bishops are over the different priests. It was a major ecclesiastical position, and he appointed who would be the bishops in the church. At the time, the papacy was so weak that there wasn't any pushback. The popes did not try to do anything about that, because at the same time that he was mastering the church in Germany, he also mastered the papacy. And I'll tell you how he did that. He was invited to Italy to solve the problems of Pope John the 12th, to bring peace and solidification to the papacy. So Pope John the 12th is asking Otto to come down and help him out, because the Pope doesn't have the power to do it. And so in doing that, Otto became the practical ruler of Italy. During this time, the papacy had reached a moral low point, with the result that it was being called a pornocracy, or rule of the harlots, with three women, Theodora, wife of a leading nobleman of Rome, and her daughters, also called Theodora and Marozia, actually ruling over the papacy. Quote, their lovers, bastard sons, and a grandson of Mariosa were made popes. And these popes were men of the most outrageous character, even as with John the 12th, openly drinking toasts to the devil and invoking pagan gods and goddesses as he rolled the dice. When a cardinal dared to rebuke him, he had the cardinal castrated. So that's the religious situation, the spiritual situation in the church. In 962, Otto came to Rome to be crowned as emperor of the Holy Roman Empire by Pope John. Now, such were John's, come on, it's not working again. There we go. Oops. I thought you were seeing that already. A slide I found online. Otto came to Rome and found that Pope John's high crimes and misdemeanors were such in November 963 that a desperate attempt had been made by church officials to oust him at a synod at St. Peter's, where John was variously accused of sacrilege, simony, perjury, murder, fornication, and incest. John refused to recognize the synod and later took terrible revenge on those who had sought to replace him as pope. He had various enemies scourged and physically mutilated. When faced with the gravity of John's licentiousness, Otto at first didn't do anything, but then he ended up removing him from the papacy in 964, and he asked the Roman clergy to find a respectable priest to replace John. They couldn't find a respectable priest in Rome to replace John. They had to get a priest from Germany. In fact, he wasn't even a priest, he was a layman. And he became Pope Leo VIII. And he had to be put through all the orders in a day to be made pope. He had to be ordained as a priest and all those things in order to be made pope. When Otto I left Rome, John, who had been deposed as pope, returned and began to wreak vengeance on the prelates who agreed to his deposition. One cardinal lost his nose, tongue, and 2 fingers. Otto, hearing about this, started back to Rome, only to learn on the way that an outraged husband had killed Pope John when he caught John raping his wife. There's the Pope of the Christian Church. Next, we come to Otto III. Now, he's a grandson of Otto I and was raised by his grandmother, the wife of Otto I, whose name was Adelheid. He was also raised by his mother, a princess from the Byzantine Empire by the name of Theophano, and by Archbishop Willigis of Mainz. He was also raised under the tutelage of the learned French scholar Gerbert. I think that's how you say it, Gerbert. Looks like Gerbert to me, but I think French it's Gerbert. Any French-speaking people? Anybody knows French? Okay, so you wouldn't know if I'm saying it right or not. He installed his cousin, Gregory V, as Pope in 996, who then, in return, crowned Otto III as emperor. The nobles of Rome, however, selected their own pope, who was promptly chased down by Otto's troops, who captured him, cut off his nose and ears, cut out his tongue, blinded him, and publicly degraded him before Otto III and Gregory V. Then he was subsequently sent to live out his life in a monastery in Germany. Well, the papacy now became a tool of German imperialism as Otto III next named his former teacher, Gerbert, to rule as Pope Sylvester II in 999. Now, just as a side note, the year 999 was a momentous year in Europe because the clock was going to turn over to the year 1000, and everybody thought something was going to happen. The Lord's going to return. It's the year 1000, stuff like that. Kind of similar to what we went through back in 2000. 1999, what's going to happen? Of course, they didn't have computers to worry about, but it was some year. So he began ruling as Pope in 999. Otto, however, died 2 years later. Gerbert, or Sylvester II, died 4 years later. Next, we come to Henry II. He was preoccupied with keeping peace in Germany, and so he really didn't have much to do with the papacy or even being in Italy, which gave the chance an opportunity to reform. Okay, here's our chance, guys. Here, those that are leaders in the church. No longer is the German emperor concerned with what we're doing, so let's make some improvements. Let's turn things around. Well, Conrad II was elected by an assembly of princes to succeed Henry II in Germany, and nothing much happened under him. Henry III then is the next king in Germany, emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And during his rule, there is not so much reform as there is more scandal, as there are going to be 3 popes. First of all, there's Pope Benedict IX, who had ascended the papacy at the ripe old age of 12. Don't you know he was really qualified to be pope? And by the age of 20, had descended into a record of vice and murder, which amazed all Europe. And he was driven out. A later pope spoke with horror of Benedict's rapes, murders, and other unspeakable acts. He was reinstated, however, by Emperor Conrad II, that I mentioned above, when the Pope offered to excommunicate all prelates who were supporting rebels against Conrad. So, political situation. Then Sylvester III was, there's a picture of Pope Benedict IX, indicating that he was in league with the devil. Next, Sylvester III is elected as Pope. And even though there was a Reform Party in existence in the church at the time, and so they were working to get some of the reform-minded people elected as Pope. There was a guy by the name of John Grarian who belonged to that group, and that group opposed simony. Do you remember what simony is? Anybody? What's simony?
Paying for something.
Paying for office, paying to be given an office. So it gets sold to the highest bidder. And so they were against that, but in order to get in, this Reform Party encouraged John to buy, with 200 pounds of gold from Benedict, the right to the papacy, and he became then Pope Gregory VI. But then, now remember, Sylvester III has already been elected, but Benedict still claims to be Pope, and so he sells it to the guy who is Gregory VI. But then Benedict had buyer's remorse or seller's remorse and decided he wanted the papacy back. And so he claimed to still be Pope. Gregory VI spent his remaining funds trying to hire soldiers to bring law and order to Rome. Assassins at that time were swarming the streets, killed within the churches even, violated women pilgrims, and reduced Rome to such a state that now the Romans were ready to appeal for imperial help to Henry II, offering him a coronation at Rome in return for aid. So for a time, they were glad the German kings were no longer had a presence there. But now things are so rotten in Rome, they're begging him to come and take control. That didn't happen till the next ruler, Henry III, came along, and he marched an army to Italy. He got rid of the 3 popes and appointed his cousin Clement II as Pope, who had been the German Bishop of Bamberg. All right, it's becoming kind of like a soap opera here. You got to, all these names, and it's a good thing they got numbers after them. Might help a little bit to keep track of them. But there's going to be more. Under Henry III, then, Pope Clement II died. There's speculation that he was poisoned by Benedict, who came back into the papacy for 8 months before being supplanted by Pope Damascus, who was accompanied by German guards. Damascus died just 28 days later. And so Henry III appointed his cousin, Leo IX, as Pope. Leo was a product of the Cluny reform. Remember the Cluny Acts, the Cluny movement? He was committed to reformation of the church. He asked all bishops prior to their consecration. In other words, before he's going to consecrate you as a bishop, he had this question. Have you been guilty of sodomy, fornication, bestiality, or adultery? Now, if he's asking that question, that tells you that there were priests, there were people that weren't priests that were trying to be bishops that were guilty of those things. Leo IX appointed 3 advisors. One was named Humbert. The other one was Hugh White. So you got 2 H's, Humbert, Hugh White. And then the third H is Hildebrand. Those are his advisors. Russus John Rushdoony, who has written a history of the church, said this. Law, and this is for looking at how the German people and the Germans looked at things. He said law was sovereign. So it's different than what the papacy was all about. In Germany, law was sovereign. If any sovereign existed, law as ancient custom, justice, and right. Every king was under law and therefore could be lawfully resisted if he broke if he broke the law. So unlike later when we have the divine right of kings, where a king could do no wrong, what the king said was what God said. And if you went against the king, you were going against God. At this time in Germany, they had a high respect for law and said if the king goes against the law, if he's lawless, then he can be resisted and unlawfully removed. You can see hints of this as we think about our own country and the beginnings of the United States. Government meant not a continuing power with unchanging authority, but office and duty. Not the state, but law was the abiding factor. The state could crumble, but the law remained. Reminds me a little bit later, Samuel Rutherford in the 18th century, I think it was, maybe 17th century, wrote a book called Lex Rex, Law is King. And that was relied upon greatly by our founding fathers as they considered what they should do in relationship to the tyranny that England was bringing to bear upon the colonies. Law is king. This Germanic reverence for law became Christianized. This meant that the function of the monarch became the creation of a Christian society. So what did they see as their purpose in governing? Was to bring about a Christian society. No monarch remained a monarch if he turned away from law. For this reason, German states could rise to great power, become empires, and then disappear completely when they ceased to move in terms of law. The disappearance of these states and empires did not produce anarchy, because their collapse came out of a concern for law. Here is the essence of constitutionalism. A ruler did not hold office until he took the oath before God to keep the faith, and his office was valid only if he were faithful. That's the German perspective on things. And you can see in some ways, at least, the German viewpoint of society was superior to the Roman Catholic viewpoint of society. In contrast to the constitutionalist supremacy of the law among the German states, the Roman Catholic Church was becoming more centralized, with supremacy embodied in the papacy. Now, I could go into a long discussion of centralization, but let me just briefly say that throughout the Bible and in history, you see that centralization always leads to decline. Centralization is against God's plan or God's will. I mean, his plan is going to happen. God is against centralization. You see it, first of all, in the Tower of Babel. What happened with the Tower of Babel? They were building a tower to build a name for themselves, and so they would not scatter. So they'd always have that tower to look to. That's not what God said. He wanted them to scatter. He wanted them to separate. They wanted a centralized government where everybody would be under the same authority. And of course, God moved against that. And then throughout a biblical history, and then that influenced our own founders as they considered that a centralized government was a government which would lead to tyranny, a government which would be a dictatorship. It's only when a government is at the local level that you can have true interaction with the people that are being governed and thereby have good government. And of course, that's one of the problems we face in our country today. I shouldn't get off into that. But the Roman Catholic Church was becoming more centralized, supremacy in the papacy. A difference came to be understood between the ideas of fealty and obedience. Fealty, remember, is when someone would kneel before their Lord and possibly the king and say that they're going to be obedient to them. They're going to do what is necessary in order to keep that king on the throne, to keep enemies away, and so on. So fealty was obedience man to man in view of a higher law. Obedience was unconditional and rendered to God alone. So fealty could be something that you would fail to do if the king, if your Lord was unfaithful to God, was moving against biblical things. Whereas obedience was something that you do because you are required to do it. It doesn't matter what the authority is, obedience is something that is given to you. And so the attitude of the Roman perspective can be summarized by a statement made by a bishop addressing a king in the mid-11th century. He said this: "To the Pope, we owe obedience. To you, we owe fealty." You understand what he's saying? To the Pope, we have to obey him no matter what. Because he's the representative of Christ. We have to do what he says. But to a king, we only owe fealty. We don't have to obey you if we deem that you are not following the law. All right, any comments or questions to this point? Before we get to the class.
Lecture was written in 1644.
Okay, 17th century. Yeah. Yeah, as soon as I said 18th, I thought, no, that's too late. Yeah. Very, very pivotal book. All right. Now let's go to the background of the pinnacle here of the clash. Henry II died in 1056, leaving to rule the 5-year-old Henry IV. With such a young and inexperienced ruler, the Roman nobles and provincial barons named Benedict X as Pope, and then proceeded to loot the churches, stealing even the gold and silver of St. Peter's Cathedral. The cardinals there in Rome took the opportunity to reform the papacy. Okay, so there's a young ruler. He's not involved. The nobles elected somebody, but here's a chance for us to step in. And so Pope Stephen, who had been selected by the Roman numerals, nobles, died, and Henry IV tried to step in and appoint his choice, while Hildebrand, one of the advisors, now is among the cardinals, and they appointed Nicholas II. The Normans, remember Normandy? That's an area of France on the coast opposite England, but they also ruled an area in Italy. They had land there, and they gave Hildebrand military assistance. They protected him. Nicholas II ended German rule over the papacy and established what's called the College of Cardinals to elect future popes. So no longer are we going to be dependent on the German emperor to appoint a pope. If the pope's going to be selected by a college of cardinals. And hopefully that would be something that would keep the papacy from becoming so immoral. So they were to elect the future popes and then merely notify the emperor. And that became the standard method. Although Hildebrand helped to put that in place, he ignored it himself when he became pope, because he basically elected himself. But I'm sure he had support of the cardinals too. All right, so Nicholas II died, and Hildebrand is so influential, might say powerful, that he's able to pick the next pope, who is Alexander II. Alexander then died, and that's when Hildebrand had himself elected on April 22nd, 1073, as Pope Gregory VI. I'm sorry, 7th, Pope Gregory VII. At the time, Henry IV was occupied by a rebellion in Germany, and so he could not intervene. Now, not having previously been a priest, Hildebrand needed to be ordained prior to being consecrated as Pope. And so that brought the charge of him being a false monk from Henry IV. Hildebrand had been an advisor to the previous 3 popes. So he knew what was going on, he knew what he was doing, and was partly responsible for the papal order that had gone forth before under another pope, commanding married priests either to give up their wives and children or to renounce the priesthood. Now, that order was not well received in Europe. Now, we're used to thinking of priests as being celibate, but that wasn't true up to this time. And until the time of the growth of the monastery movements of Cluny and Cistercia, ordained parish priests were married. It was in the monastery movement that they were not married. And then they tried to enforce that upon the priests in churches. At least one pope, Hadrian II, in 867 to 872, was a married man. Monks were usually not ordained men, but they were celibate. Later on, they began to be ordained. The impulse to sacerdotal celibacy was really a Neoplatonic and unbiblical concept of the world and of material things. In other words, this idea of being celibate was a Neoplatonic, in other words, seeing material things as evil, spiritual things as good. And if you are partaking of physical things, that is less than or immoral compared to spiritual. And as we've looked at the monks so far, we're going to see even more when we look at a couple future movements. Spirituality is denying yourself of everything, and that included sexual relations or even familial relations. In this struggle between the celibate monks and married priests, the papacy sided with the monks. There had long been a bitter struggle in each area between local monasteries, which were completely independent, and the parish clergy, who were married, deeply absorbed in political issues, alive to social trends, and clearly as Christians living in the world. So try to get this picture. The parish priests were a part of the world. Remember, the monks were not part of the world. They separated themselves. They were living off by themselves in their monasteries, enclosed, not having anything to do with the world around them, living celibate lives. And they tried to enforce that upon the priests because the papacy did not like the fact that priests and bishops were more under the authority of local people rather than of the papacy, whereas the monks were under the papacy, if you follow that. The monks at their best were living out of the world, unconcerned by its problems, dedicated to learning and to spiritual exercises. Now, the monasteries became much wealthier than the local clergy and the bishops, but they were very contemptuous of the worldly clergy because they were associated with the world. Some of the greatest learning came out of the monasteries, it is certain, but also much of the greatest corruption came out of the monasteries. Gregory VII dedicated himself, remember he's the Pope, was Hildebrand. He dedicated himself to the abolition of lay investiture, which means that the king or local authority, political authorities would appoint the bishops. He also dedicated himself to the abolition of simony, people buying office, and the enforcement of clerical celibacy as the best ways to reform the Roman Church into an institution under the central control of the papacy. So in other words, some of the things he was wanting to do were good reforms, but they were primarily focused on bringing more and more authority to the papacy. So we could say, yeah, it's a good thing to abolish simony. But that was because if people are paying for offices, they're not paying him. They're paying the local magistrate or a king. And so we got to get rid of that. We've got to get rid of people being married, priests being married. We've got to get rid of lay investiture. The last of these reforms was enforced ruthlessly. That is the one of enforcing clerical celibacy. The Cardinal of Milan attacked the wives of the clergy there with the most obscene invectives, called them names that I couldn't even say. In Italy, married priests were castrated and lost their noses and ears as well. By awarding the property of married clerics to informants, hoodlums were encouraged to plunder the homes of the clergy and to plant feminine garments on even the innocent and complying clergy, so that both married and celibate clergy were attacked by the armed mobs. The wives and daughters of the clergy, usually the outstanding of the parish, were treated as prostitutes. In 1075, Pope Gregory VII issued a statement in which he claimed that the church has been infallible in the past and will always be so in the future. Okay, I got behind on my slides. There's the last thing we talked about. This is significant, as you can imagine. Everyone who disagreed with the church, said Gregory, were not Catholic Christians, and therefore not saved. So since the church is infallible, you can't disagree. The document went on to say that the Pope is supreme and that his spiritual authority is absolute and cannot be questioned, and that all secular powers owed allegiance to the Pope. Therefore, the Pope alone has power to depose or reconcile bishops. There it comes. The Pope alone has the power to say who's going to be a bishop. The king does not. Local authorities do not. It all comes back to the Pope, because the Pope has all of the supreme power. And how can you disagree with that when you know that since the church is infallible, the Pope is supreme? If you disagree, you're no longer a Christian and you're going to hell. That Gregory VII ruled viciously can be evidenced in the occasion of a cardinal wanting to punish an abbot who had the eyes of some of his monks gouged out for their sins. Now you think, well, maybe that abbot ought to be punished for gouging out the eyes of some monks. But Gregory instead made a bishop of this abbot. But the more papal authority became Roman, the less it became biblical, and the more important tradition became to Rome. The clash occurred when both Henry IV and Gregory VII appointed the Archbishop of Milan. Now, another thing to understand is that bishops were both church officers and powerful lords over church lands, placing them under the authority of both church and state. So a bishop was a church official under the papacy, but he's also the person who oversees land owned by the church, which makes him under the authority of the king, because it's land in his kingdom. So he's like a dual person, having, as it were, two bodies, one as a lord temporal and the other as a lord spiritual. The struggle involved authority over both. A distinction was made between the two persons of a bishop, and the bishop himself was always conscious of it. In an extreme case, a French bishop laid claim to strict celibacy as a bishop while being married as a baron. So while he's in the church office, he's celibate. When he goes home to his wife, he owns land, and so he's married. And there were some other ridiculous things that occurred as a result of this dual personality or dual roles. All right, so they're both claiming to be able to appoint the bishop. Gregory threatened to excommunicate Henry and release all his subjects. Now, what does that mean? Well, you know what it means to excommunicate. If he excommunicates him, he's no longer in the church and therefore has no salvation. He is going to hell, not purgatory, to hell. That's excommunication. Now, Gregory also, and that's enough, because if you understand, if you believe that the Pope has the keys of heaven, then you think he has the authority to do that. But he also said he would release all his subjects. What this means is that it would be communicated to the people in Germany that because their king was no longer faithful, was faithless, they no longer had to obey him. knowing that the Germans are very lawful, they know that if their king doesn't fulfill the law, that they don't have to obey him, and the Gregory would be releasing them from that obligation. So if you're a king and you have no salvation, and then the people won't obey you, what good are you? Right? What do you have? So that was Gregory's threat. Well, Henry IV, German emperor, together with a council that met at the city of Worms, which would become very famous later on in the 16th century, rejected the papal authority in January 1076, repudiating Gregory, declaring that Gregory was not a pope, but a false monk. Henry IV continued to invest bishops. The next year, Gregory excommunicated him, declared him deposed as a monarch, and decided to go to Augsburg to release Henry's subjects from oaths of loyalty. So he was actually going to go into German territory and there tell the people, you are released, make a pronouncement. This would sanction rebellion against Henry IV and result in chaos throughout Germany, because Henry did have enemies who would use this to rebel against him. So he's in a tight spot. His enemies threatened just that if he did not get release from Gregory's sentence of excommunication against him. Again, for to be outside the faith was to be liable for the throne to be taken away. So Henry came up with an ingenious plan. He, his wife, and his baby son intercepted Gregory in the Alps mountains at Canossa in northern Italy. The penitent Henry stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days, waiting for the Pope to speak to him. And of course, at first, Gregory wanted nothing to do with it. But as time went on, sentiment started to fall on the side of Henry. Here's this poor guy standing in bare feet out in the snow, and the Pope won't even see him. So eventually, Pope Gregory allowed him to come in, and Gregory released him from his sentence, but he felt he had won a great victory for the papacy. However, his unpopularity increased, and Henry's dramatic sense of respect for law was enhanced. Gregory says, as Pope, I could have removed you from the throne. Henry's response, you cannot control me. It boils it down to its essentials. The excommunication and deposition were imposed a second time, and a substitute king was even named by Gregory. This rival emperor, Rudolph of Swabia, had his right hand blessed by the Pope, and someone has said only to lose his arm and life in battle. After being excommunicated the second time, Henry assembled an army in 1084, marching into Italy, and captured and imprisoned Gregory. He replaced him with Wibert or Gerbet as Pope Clement III, who then crowned Henry as emperor. Gregory was forced to flee to Salerno, where he died. And that's the Normans of southern Italy had taken him south with them to Monte Cassino. Gregory died a miserable man, declaring, I have loved justice and hated iniquity, and therefore I die in exile. All the same, he had won in some ways. He had successfully laid the foundations of papal absolutism. So even though Henry had a temporary victory, in the end, it's papal authority that's going to win. The result of this was a gathering together at the city of Worms again, where a compromise was reached in 1122 between Emperor Henry V, the next emperor, and Pope Calixtus II. In this agreement, the church retained the right to elect its own bishops and abbots and to invest them with spiritual authority. So church has that right. These elections had to be held in the presence of the emperor or his representatives so they can see what's going on. The emperor retained the right to invest church officials with secular authority. So again, the church can select the bishops, but the emperor has the right to give them whatever secular authority they need to function as landowners. Secondly, church officials were to take an oath of loyalty to the temporal ruler who happened to be his feudal overlord. So the church gets to appoint the bishop, but then the bishop has to give fealty, an oath of loyalty to whatever lord is over the land that he is in charge of. And then thirdly, the church was freed from German political control in Italy. So that's the investiture crisis, conflict, what happened during it, and how in some ways it sets up what's going to continue to occur in Europe, both with papal authority becoming stronger and the local authorities, including kings, trying to break away from that authority. So by the time we get to Martin Luther, it's only because of that sense of political independence that he is able to escape being burned as a heretic. All right, any questions about what has occurred? A lot of names, a lot of events, but hopefully you got an idea of the flow of things.
How are the popes elected today?
College of Cardinals.
Okay.
Yeah, so what they, that's another thing that's important here. What they established there is what is continued. So no longer, or since then, there has not been, as far as I remember, any political oversight or political appointment. It's been from the College of Cardinals. So that was a good reform. I mean, as things go in the Roman Catholic Church.
I have a question. Don't they claim that all the popes are descended from Peter?
Yes.
But don't they?
Well,
also
not physically.
Not physically.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the authority, yeah.
Okay.
And see, at one time, there's 3 of them.
Yeah. So who has the authority?
Won't be the last time.
No.
No,
Oh boy.
there'll be another time when it'll be 3 popes at once. All claiming to have the keys of the kingdom. All claiming to be infallible. And of course, the other important thing that we looked at tonight was the declaration that the church has always been and always will be infallible, and that the Pope is the supreme authority. And all you need to back up something like that is for people to believe it.
When you say infallible, they don't claim to be sinless.
In their pronouncements, what they're saying is the truth and needs to be followed. So in a sense, yeah, they don't say they're sinless in their personal lives, but what the church says is authoritative, what the Pope says. Now later it'll be clarified that when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, which is from his throne, that those are the things that are perfect and to be followed, that just him talking is not necessarily something that's authoritative, but it sort of begins here, although we can see further back some instances where it was heading that direction. Even back with first Gregory looked at. So Gregory the First, Gregory the Great. I can't remember if he was first or if there's another number. I think he was first. Who invented Gregorian chant and really brought all the 7 sacraments into the church as being authoritative. So it's been coming and just was stated clearly here. Any other comments? Now, if you are a Roman Catholic, it would just give you great comfort in the church.
I grew up Catholic and I did not know all this.
Oh, few do. We gotta tell you. You know, few members of any religious denomination or group know what the group actually believes. A few Roman Catholics know what the church actually teaches. A few of any group, no, a few Mormons know even what Mormonism teaches. So it's not surprising. All right, one more thing that I will expose you to tonight, and that is that around in this time period, around 1150, we have the beginnings of some universities. We'll talk more about education later, but I thought I'd throw this in here. In 1150, the University of Paris was founded.
What year?
1150. And I'll explain the advent of scholastic institutions later. But since it happened at this time period, I thought I'd let you know. It didn't look like this at the beginning, I'm sure. And also the University of Bologna, Europe's oldest university. They say 1088. I have 1150.
So were these religious or political?
Yeah. They were religious institutions. I mean, you know, because again, in Europe at this time, there, in some ways, there's no separation between religious and political, or religious and non-religious, because you know, the Roman Catholic Church and Catholicism was a part of their whole lives.
So at which point did it officially become the Roman Catholic Church?
Well, that would be probably, I guess I would say that we can start thinking of it in those terms in the fall, at the fall of Rome. So, you know, by, which is what, I think 476. So by 500, you know, at the beginning of the Middle Ages, it is the Roman Catholic Church that is in charge of all of Europe. They don't necessarily know that yet. They, the tentacles of authority haven't necessarily reached all throughout, but you know, you think about Augustine of Canterbury, that he's called later, who was sent as a missionary by Pope Gregory the Great into England to convert the Anglo-Saxons. You know, he is coming with a perspective of the Roman Church. At the same time, there are missionaries that have come from Ireland over to Scotland through the influence of Patrick and then Columba, who are coming south through Scotland into northern England, and the two groups end up, to make it simple, end up meeting and didn't know that each other really existed. The northern missionaries coming down, descendants of Patrick and Columba, were very Orthodox believers, whereas Augustine of Canterbury represented what was already a corrupt system under Rome.
Yeah, so it was the fall of Rome. After that, it became the Holy Roman Empire, which you're explaining how that, I never really realized how integrated and complex.
Yeah.
From Charlemagne was the Holy Roman Empire.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. This, I found this slide, thought you'd be interested, concerning the University of Bologna. They say founded in 1088. Students lived in the surrounding community. They were unruly, drunk, vagrants, and the university claimed no control over the living environment. Sort of like a modern state campus.
Ohio
over
State,
there.
yeah.
The students haven't changed. All right. We're going to stop there tonight because next we're going to begin a new section on the new religious orders. And again, some of this is going to overlap. It's not entirely chronological because it's so hard to break up a subject over many years. So we kind of have to plug it in where we can. We're going to look at some religious orders, and particularly Next week, we're going to be looking at the Franciscans, who are followers of Francis of Assisi. How many have heard of Francis of Assisi? Okay, everybody. So hopefully I'm going to share some things with you next week that you don't know about him, and we can evaluate what we think. All right, any final comments or questions? If you're following on YouTube, please like, subscribe, follow, tell a friend. All right, no comments. We will be dismissed. Thanks for coming out.
Makes our political climate today not seem.
That's-